As the clock struck midnight, the silence of the city swallowed the streets whole. Daniel had always been fond of walking alone in the late hours. Something about the stillness calmed his mind. But tonight, the air felt different. It was thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was watching from the shadows. He stuffed his hands deep into the pockets of his jacket, hoping to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had started to nibble at his thoughts. The street lamps flickered above, casting long wavering shadows that danced with the wind. His footsteps echoed off the damp pavement, each one growing louder and more pronounced as he ventured further into the unfamiliar part of town. "Must be the weather," Daniel muttered, trying to reason with himself. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The sound of a distant dog barking was the only thing that broke the silence, and it suddenly stopped. Everything stopped. Not a sound. Not a movement. Suddenly a figure appeared in the distance. At first, Daniel thought it was just a trick of the light, but as it grew closer he realized it was a man, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his eyes gleamed from the shadows. Was this person following him? He stopped, heart racing. The man didn't speak. He only watched, his eyes fixated on Daniel like a predator. The moment the figure disappeared into the shadows, Daniel's legs finally responded. His heart thudded like a drum, pounding against his ribs, and adrenaline sharpened every nerve. He dashed around the corner, the glow of the 24-hour diner ahead, promising the faintest taste of safety, but something inside him, a low whisper of instinct, made him glance back. The figure was there again, closer now, standing in front of the diner as if it owned the light, its presence swallowing the warmth and casting a cold eclipse over the entrance. Daniel froze, the hope draining from him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The man didn't move or speak. He simply watched, an impossibly still sentinel. And in that silence Daniel felt the weight of being hunted, the city's quiet turning into a cage around him. What did it want from him? When the figure stepped aside into the dark corridor beyond the diner's door, Daniel's muscles finally obeyed. He bolted, lungs burning, turning into a narrow alley that promised concealment. The world blurred around him. Every breath felt like shards in his chest. Then impulsively, he looked back. The figure was there again, impossibly closer, blocking the dim exit of the alley, as if it had grown from the shadows themselves. A cold knot formed in his gut. "Not again," he whispered, voice barely audible, his body fighting its instinct to flee, and the paralysis of shock. The alley's walls seemed to lean inward. The promise of escape collapsed under the unbearable knowledge that whatever was hunting him bent reality to stay always one step ahead. He was trapped in a tightening loop. Daniel's pulse pounded as he backed away, then broke into a sprint when the alley offered no sanctuary. The figure didn't pursue. It didn't need to. Its stillness was a threat in itself, a gravity that pulled on his sense of safety. He twisted deeper into the labyrinth of backstreets, the stench of decay clinging to his clothes, breaths ragged and uneven. Every sound seemed amplified, the whistle of wind through broken pipes, the distant hum of a dying street lamp. He reached a dead end, the brick wall rising like an accusation, and for a moment he thought he might have outrun the presence. Then he turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. The figure was closer, just beyond the faint glow of a failing light, its inscrutable posture unbroken. Daniel's mind screamed, but his legs refused to cooperate. It felt as if invisible threads held him, tethered to the moment. He didn't turn away. He couldn't. The figure had followed him into the cul-de-sac of his own dread. Daniel stood frozen, pressed against the damp brick, every instinct screaming for escape, but his feet were lead. The figure's hood hid the face, but the eyes, cold, calculating, unblinking, glowed faintly from the darkness. His voice wavered as he shouted, "Who are you?" The sound cracked against the walls, swallowed instantly. The figure didn't answer. It only lifted its hands slowly, deliberately, as if testing the boundary between them. Daniel's world narrowed to the space between his shaking frame and that silent form. There was no path forward, no refuge. The terror wasn't a story anymore. It was a presence, tangible and waiting. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood frozen in the alley. The dark figure remained motionless at the end of the path, his presence now more suffocating than ever. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as his mind screamed for him to run, but his feet were cemented to the ground. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck, the chill of the night air making him shiver uncontrollably. His eyes darted from side to side, searching for any way out, but the alley seemed to stretch on endlessly. The walls closed in on him, as if the very city itself was conspiring to trap him. In a daze, Daniel stumbled backward, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't answer. It never spoke. It just watched. The air around him grew even colder, and as he stumbled further back into the shadows, his sense of reality began to blur. Every flicker of light from the distant street lamp seemed to warp, casting distorted shapes across the alley. Daniel was not alone. He never had been. Daniel's legs finally moved, fueled by the raw instinct to survive. He sprinted down the alley, but the sound of footsteps following him was relentless. They echoed, louder and louder, as if the figure was right behind him, matching his every step. His chest burned, and his legs screamed for relief, but he couldn't stop. The fear of being caught, of being dragged into the shadows, pushed him forward. He reached the end of the alley, his eyes scanning for an exit. There was a small door to a service entrance, slightly ajar. With no other choice, Daniel bolted for it, pushing the door open with all his strength. The cool air inside hit him like a wave, but the relief was short-lived. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow space. He spun around, desperately searching for a place to hide, but the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, still echoed. Daniel pushed through the door, heart hammering, and stepped into the narrow hallway beyond. The space was cramped, the walls lined with old rusting pipes. The air was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and dust. He glanced over his shoulder, no sign of the figure yet, but the fear that it was still there, lurking in the shadows, kept him on edge. He moved deeper into the hallway, trying to steady his breath. The footsteps had stopped, but Daniel wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a terrible one. He reached out to push open a door on his left, his hand shaking as it touched the cold metal handle. The door creaked open slowly, and Daniel stepped inside, immediately hit by the warmth of the room. It seemed to be some sort of storage closet, filled with old equipment and cardboard boxes. The faint smell of grease lingered in the air. It was dark, but there was a faint glow from a flickering light above. He slid to the floor, trying to control his breathing, and waited. Nothing happened. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on as Daniel huddled in the corner of the room, eyes fixed on the door. He hadn't heard any more footsteps, but the silence was deafening. He forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to calm his racing mind. Every creak of the building made him jump, his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching him from somewhere. Somehow. Then a sound, a soft scraping, echoed from outside the room. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The figure was near. Suddenly, the door to the storage room creaked open. Daniel froze. He didn't dare move, didn't dare even breathe. He could feel the figure's presence on the other side of the door, the heavy weight of it pressing down on him. A shadow passed over the threshold. The figure was here. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, its shadow stretching across the floor of the room. Daniel could hear nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was just there, an overwhelming presence that filled the space. Minutes felt like hours. Daniel's mind raced, but his body refused to act. The fear was paralyzing. Was this how it ended? Trapped in a storage closet, waiting for something that would never leave. Just as Daniel thought he could bear it no longer, the figure's hand reached out and gently pushed the door the rest of the way open. Daniel's heart dropped. He was too exposed now. He had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed himself into the corner of the room, desperately trying to make himself as small as possible. He could feel the floor beneath him, cold and unforgiving, as if the very building was rejecting him. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every sound, every creak and groan of the old building sent his pulse racing. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to make Daniel's blood run cold. Every breath felt like it could be his last. And then, as if to add to the terror, the silence was broken. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the scraping of a boot on the floor, sounded from the doorway. The figure shifted, the sound of fabric rustling, as it stepped forward into the room. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the door slammed shut with a finality that reverberated through his bones. He was trapped. "Please, no," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse with fear, but the figure did not respond. The figure stepped further into the room, its shadow stretching across the floor like a dark omen. Daniel could feel the figure's gaze on him, even though he couldn't see its face. There was no noise, no movement, just an overwhelming, suffocating silence that seemed to envelop everything. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as the figure moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate. The air grew colder with each step, and the temperature seemed to drop, the walls closing in. It was as if the room itself was shrinking, the walls pressing in on him, forcing him to confront the terror that stood before him. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Daniel cried out, his voice cracking with fear. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen with terror. He couldn't move. The figure was too close now. Suddenly, without warning, the figure lunged forward. Daniel barely had time to react before the figure was on him. The force of its presence was overwhelming, its movements fast and fluid. Before Daniel could even scramble to his feet, the figure's cold hand gripped his arm, yanking him upright. "Let go of me!" Daniel screamed, but the figure didn't flinch. It was like trying to escape from a stone wall. The figure didn't speak, didn't need to. Its grip tightened, its fingers digging into his skin, cold and unyielding. Desperation surged through Daniel as he struggled, his fingers clawing at the figure's hand, trying to break free. But it was futile. The figure simply stared at him, its face still hidden in the darkness, as if enjoying the terror it caused. With every pull, every desperate attempt to escape, the figure just held him tighter, dragging him toward the door. The door to the storage room creaked open, the harsh noise slicing through the tension in the air. The figure didn't stop. It kept dragging Daniel forward, its pace unhurried, almost as though it was savoring the moment. Daniel's mind raced, his body screaming for freedom, but it was as if he was trapped in a nightmare. No matter how hard he fought, how desperately he pulled away, the figure's grip never faltered. He was dragged down a narrow hallway, each step feeling like an eternity. The cold walls seemed to close in on him, the dim lighting creating long, unnatural shadows that distorted everything around him. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though it was pressing down on him with each passing second. "Where are you taking me?" Daniel gasped, his voice hoarse. But the figure remained silent, its cold eyes never leaving his face. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, but just as Daniel thought he might collapse from exhaustion, the figure finally stopped. It released him with a suddenness that sent Daniel stumbling forward, his legs weak from the relentless struggle. They had reached a door, solid, old, and heavy. The figure stepped aside, allowing Daniel to see it fully for the first time. A chilling realization hit him. The door wasn't an exit. It was a prison. The figure's cold hand reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly, deliberately. Daniel's breath hitched, the sound of the door creaking echoing in the silence. "No, please," Daniel begged, but the figure didn't listen. It opened the door. The darkness beyond was even more suffocating than the room they had just left. It felt endless, like a void that would consume him whole. The door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan, the darkness beyond stretching endlessly. Daniel stood there, his heart hammering in his chest as the figure moved aside, allowing him to glimpse into the void that awaited. His breath caught in his throat. The air beyond the door was thick, colder than anything he'd ever felt before, and it seemed to pull at him, as though trying to suck him in. "No, no, I won't go in there," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with a mixture of terror and defiance. He tried to pull away, but the figure moved closer, its cold hand gently resting on his shoulder. The touch was ice, and Daniel flinched, his body instinctively tensing, but there was no escape. "You can't keep me here," Daniel muttered, his words shaky but fierce. The figure didn't respond, merely standing there, its presence overwhelming and unyielding. The figure's silence weighed on Daniel like 100-ton stone. He felt the icy grip tighten on his shoulder, urging him forward. But every instinct in his body screamed to run, to escape from whatever nightmare this had become. The figure didn't need to speak. Its presence alone was enough to make Daniel's heart race, and he felt as though the walls of the hallway were closing in, squeezing the air from his lungs. With trembling hands, Daniel pushed against the figure, but it barely budged. The figure simply tilted its head slightly, as if amused by his futile resistance. The cold air around him seemed to intensify, and every breath Daniel took felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. "I won't go in there," Daniel whispered again, his voice shaking but firm. But the figure only continued to watch him, unmoving. Daniel stumbled backward as the figure released its grip. He felt the coldness lingering in the air, an almost tangible presence that seemed to follow him as he backed into the hallway. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. The silence between them stretched on, unbearably long. Then the figure moved forward, its slow, deliberate steps reverberating through the empty hallway. Daniel's pulse quickened as the figure reached for him again, its cold fingers brushing against his arm. He recoiled instinctively, a chill running down his spine, but the figure didn't react. It merely moved closer, its movements calm and calculated. "You can't escape," it seemed to say without words. Daniel felt a wave of panic wash over him. The figure wasn't just a person. It was something far worse, something beyond his understanding. "Please, I don't understand," Daniel gasped, his voice trembling as the figure moved ever closer, its cold breath brushing against his face. He could no longer keep his thoughts straight. The fear had overtaken him entirely, clouding his reasoning. He felt trapped, cornered by the darkness, both outside and inside himself. The figure stood in front of him now, its silent presence completely dominating the space. Daniel wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but he couldn't bring himself to do either. The figure leaned in, its hood casting its face into shadow. For the first time, Daniel felt an odd sensation, a flicker of recognition, as if the figure wasn't a stranger after all. "No?" Daniel whispered, shaking his head, unable to process what he was feeling. The figure stood still, watching him, its cold eyes hidden beneath the hood. Suddenly, it clicked. Daniel's blood ran cold as the realization hit him like a wave of ice. The figure, it wasn't some random stranger. It wasn't even human. The face, the eyes, everything fell into place. "You," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "You're me." The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy. The figure did not respond, but the silent acknowledgement in its posture sent a chill through Daniel's spine. It was like looking into a dark mirror, seeing his own reflection, but twisted, distorted by something far darker. The figure reached out once again, its cold hand brushing Daniel's cheek. "I am what you've become," the figure seemed to whisper, its voice a faint echo in Daniel's mind. "There's no escaping this." Daniel's entire world seemed to collapse around him, as the realization hit him like a freight train. The figure in front of him, this creature, this being, it wasn't just a random nightmare. It wasn't some monster or predator. It was him. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its hands still outstretched, still as cold as ice. The figure's eyes glinted in the dim light, and in them, Daniel saw the reflection of his own soul, a reflection twisted and distorted, corrupted by something darker. "No," Daniel whispered again, his mind unable to comprehend the horror he was facing. How is this possible?" The figure didn't speak. It simply tilted its head, its movements almost curious, as if watching Daniel unravel before him. "You're me," Daniel said, his voice breaking as the truth slowly settled into his bones. "But how?" The figure only stood there, a silent observer, waiting. The figure's hand dropped slowly to its side, and for a moment there was only silence. Daniel's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This thing, this reflection of himself, wasn't just an enemy. It was a part of him, a twisted version that had somehow come to life. "What did you do to me?" Daniel's voice trembled with a mix of anger and desperation. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching him with its cold, empty gaze. Suddenly, Daniel's vision blurred. His thoughts began to fragment, like pieces of a shattered mirror. The figure before him seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't quite real, as if it was part of some larger, incomprehensible puzzle. And then, like a slap to the face, the answer hit him. The figure wasn't the problem. It was the solution. The world around Daniel seemed to shift as the truth settled in his mind. The figure was him, but it wasn't just his reflection. It was his past, his choices, his sins. This dark version of himself was the manifestation of everything he had repressed, the shadow of guilt and regret that he had tried so desperately to ignore. "Is this my punishment?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and understanding. "Is this what I deserve?" The figure didn't answer, but the look in its eyes, the cold, unwavering stare, seemed to say everything. The weight of Daniel's past was crushing him, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He felt the darkness surrounding him, threatening to swallow him whole. And then, the figure stepped forward once more, its hand reaching out slowly, as if inviting Daniel to accept the truth. The figure's hand moved closer, brushing Daniel's cheek with an ice-cold touch. Daniel flinched, but the contact was fleeting. The figure's gaze never wavered, its eyes locked onto Daniel's as if it were waiting for something, waiting for him to surrender. "Why?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why now? Why are you showing me this?" The figure did not respond with words. Instead, it seemed to step back, as if giving Daniel a moment to process what he had just discovered. But the truth was inescapable, and Daniel could feel it deep within him. This creature, this version of himself, it wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of his very soul, a manifestation of everything he had tried to suppress. And there was no running from it. There was no escaping what he had become. The figure stepped back slowly, its form fading into the shadows, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway. The truth had been revealed, but it felt like a crushing weight on his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had consumed him, and in that moment, he realized he could never escape it. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. The tears came, but they were not for the fear he had felt, not for the horror of the figure. No, they came for the loss of innocence, loss of the man he had been before he had let the darkness consume him. There was no redemption. There was only this. The figure had not come to kill him. It had come to show him the truth. Daniel sat in the darkness, unable to move, unable to speak. The weight of everything, the truth, the figure, his own guilt, pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating him. His mind was a blur, fragments of memories and thoughts swirling together in a chaotic mess. The truth that had been revealed to him, the figure, his own reflection twisted in shadow, had shattered him. He had always known there was something wrong, something he could never face. But now, it had come crashing down, and he was left to confront the consequences of his own actions, his own failures. The hallway around him seemed to close in further, the shadows thickening with every breath he took. He wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. There was nothing left but the dark void that stretched out in front of him. His body trembled with the weight of his own despair, and for a moment he wished it would all just end. But it didn't. It never did. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sounds of his own breathing. Daniel's mind raced, thoughts spinning faster than he could process. He couldn't escape the reality that had been thrust upon him. The figure wasn't just some manifestation of his guilt. It was his destiny, his future if he continued down the path he had chosen. With trembling hands, he reached for the floor, his fingers scraping against the cold, rough surface. It was all too much. Everything, his mistakes, his failures, his regret, was crushing him from all sides. He had built this darkness himself, brick by brick, and now it was the only thing left. "I've become it," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse. This is what I am now." The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but they were true. He had become the very thing he feared the most. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence, a faint scrape of metal, followed by the creak of a door opening. Daniel's head snapped up, his body tense as he listened. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the sound felt like a signal, like a door to another world, one that was waiting for him. He stood shakily, his legs unsteady as he took a tentative step forward. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been closed before, was now open, a thin sliver of light spilling out from the cracks. The figure had disappeared, leaving behind only the sound of the door opening, beckoning him. Daniel didn't know why, but he felt compelled to walk toward it. Something inside him told him that he had to face whatever lay beyond that door. He had no choice. Daniel's heart raced as he moved toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The air around him seemed to grow colder with every inch he took, and the sense of dread in his chest intensified. He wasn't sure what awaited him behind the door, but he knew that he had no choice. He had to see it through. His fingers brushed against the doorframe as he reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shock of discomfort through him. Taking a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, save for the faint light that spilled in from the hallway. It felt like the entire world outside had been left behind. The door creaked shut behind him as he stepped into the room. The walls were bare, the floor cold and uninviting. In the center of the room was a lone chair, its back turned to him. The figure sat there, still and unmoving. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Daniel muttered under his breath. Daniel took a step into the room, the floor creaking beneath his feet. His eyes never left the figure sitting in the chair, its stillness unnerving. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with silence, each second stretching longer than the last. Then slowly, the figure turned in the chair, its face finally revealed. It was him, exactly like before, but somehow different. There was no warmth in its eyes, no humanity. Just cold, emotionless emptiness. "You're me," Daniel whispered again, his voice trembling. "But why?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it simply stared at him, its gaze unwavering. In the silence, Daniel realized something even more terrifying. The figure wasn't just a reflection of his past. It was his future. This was what he had become if he continued down this path, lost, broken, empty. "I don't want to be you," Daniel said, his voice breaking. Daniel's eyes were locked on the figure in the chair, his mind racing. The truth was undeniable now. He had come face to face with the version of himself he had always feared, an empty shell, a broken man lost in the shadows of his own making. But as he stood there, trembling, a strange sense of understanding began to form within him. "I've been running from this," Daniel muttered under his breath. "I've been running from myself." The figure didn't speak, but Daniel could feel its cold gaze pressing into him. The weight of the realization was suffocating, but it was also liberating. For the first time, Daniel understood that the figure, the darkness, it wasn't an external force. It was him, all along. The mistakes, the regrets, the guilt, it was his to carry. "I can't escape this," Daniel whispered. "But I can face it." The figure didn't move, didn't react. But Daniel felt its presence more strongly than ever before. The air around him seemed to grow colder, and for a moment he thought he could hear a whisper, just a faint sound, barely audible. "It's too late." Daniel shook his head, trying to block out the voice. The figure was right. He had waited too long. He had let his fears, his regrets, and his guilt build up until they consumed him. But now, in this moment, he couldn't afford to give in. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The fear was still there, gnawing at him, but now there was something else, a glimmer of resolve. "I'm not running anymore," Daniel whispered. "I'm facing you." Daniel reached out, his hand trembling, but his resolve unshaken. He needed to touch the figure, to confront it head on. As his fingers brushed against the cold chair, the figure stirred. It was subtle at first, just the faintest movement. But it was enough. The figure slowly turned its head to face him, its cold, empty eyes staring into Daniel's soul. The silence between them was deafening, and in that moment, Daniel realized something else. This was not just a fight for survival. This was a fight for his very soul. "I'm not afraid of you," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the terror that still gripped him. "I'm not afraid of what I've become." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like the prey. He was no longer running. For a moment, the figure remained still, and Daniel could almost hear the beating of his own heart. The figure seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for Daniel to make the next move. But this time, Daniel wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to be consumed by the darkness that had taken over his life for so long. "I've spent my life hiding," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "Running from my mistakes, my fears. But no more." The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its cold stare was enough to send a shiver down Daniel's spine. But this time, the fear was different. It wasn't the paralyzing fear he had known before. It was something else, a realization, a recognition. "I can't change the past," Daniel continued, his voice growing steadier. "But I can choose what happens next." There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosion of power. Instead, there was simply silence. A stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Daniel stood in front of the figure, his body trembling but his heart steady. The fear had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled him. He had faced the darkness within himself and found the strength to stand up to it. The figure's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging Daniel's resolve. And then, with a final movement, it slowly stood up from the chair, its form shifting in the darkness. But this time Daniel didn't flinch. He held his ground. "You're free," the figure seemed to whisper, though it never moved its lips. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his burdens lift.